Welcome to the Sleeping Dragon, where stories come to life as you drift into worlds of myth and mystery. So, settle in, close your eyes, and let the stories carry you away as you gently drift to a good night's sleep. In the beginning, before the shaping of Ada, the world was but an idea, a dream in the mind of Eru Iluvatar, the One. In this timeless void, where light and darkness had yet to be defined, there existed the Ainur, the Holy Ones, the first beings brought into existence by the thought of Iluvatar. Each of these beings was imbued with a fragment of Iluvatar's infinite wisdom, and through them, his will would eventually give shape to the cosmos. The Ainur were not mere spirits, they were entities of immense power, each with its own unique essence and purpose. Some were mighty and towering, others delicate and ethereal, yet all were bound by a common purpose, to fulfill the will of Iluvatar and to participate in the grand design that would bring the universe into being. Among these Ainur was one who shone brighter than most, a being of fire and brilliance, known as Meron. Meron was a spirit of fire and craftsmanship, his being suffused with a love for order, beauty, and creation. His heart was a furnace of inspiration, and his mind was ever turning, imagining wonders beyond comprehension. He delighted in the art of making, of shaping raw materials into objects of splendor and utility. In the timeless halls of the Ainur, Meron was revered for his skill, and his creations were unmatched in their elegance and precision. His fire was not the wild, untamed flame that consumes without thought, but a controlled, purposeful force, like the forge that tempers steel. It was this very love of order that made Meron susceptible to a darker influence, one that would eventually lead him down a path of corruption. For in his desire to bring perfection to all things, to impose his vision upon the world, he began to crave control. He believed that with enough power, he could mold the very fabric of reality, bending it to his will and purging it of all imperfection. In those early days, however, Meron's heart was still pure, his intentions noble. He joined with his fellow Ainur in a grand symphony, the Unwind, a cosmic music that would lay the foundations of the world. The Unwind was more than a song, it was the embodiment of creation itself. Through their music, the Ainur poured their thoughts and desires into the void, and from this harmony, the world began to take shape. Imagine, if you will, the splendor of that primordial song, the voices of the Ainur, each unique and perfect, rising and falling in a melody that transcended time and space. It was a music that could be seen as well as heard, a tapestry of light and sound, with each note giving birth to stars, oceans, and mountains. The harmonies intertwined, creating a world of boundless beauty and infinite potential. Yet, within this grand symphony, there emerged a dissonance. Melkor, the mightiest of the Ainur, who was also the most proud and willful, sought to impose his own theme upon the music. He was not content to simply contribute to the harmony, he desired to dominate it, to bend it to his will. His notes were powerful, but they were jarring, introducing chaos into the symphony. Where there had been harmony, now there was discord, and the other Ainur struggled to maintain the balance of the music against Melkor's growing influence. Meron, ever drawn to strength and order, found himself intrigued by Melkor's defiance. At first he resisted the pull, striving to remain true to the original harmony of the Unwind. He continued to sing his part, contributing his brilliance to the unfolding creation. But as the discord grew, so too did Meron's fascination with the power that Melkor wielded. He began to see in Melkor's rebellion a means to achieve his own ends, a way to impose his vision of perfection upon the world, not through harmony, but through control. It is important to understand that Meron did not fall into darkness all at once. His corruption was a slow, insidious process, like the gradual tarnishing of a bright metal. At first, he believed that he could use Melkor's power for good, that he could harness the chaos to bring about a greater order. But over time, the darkness began to seep into his heart, twisting his desires and clouding his judgment. His love for creation became a lust for domination, and his desire for order turned into a need to control all life. In the Unwind, as in all creation, every action had consequences. The discord sown by Melkor began to manifest in the world that was being shaped by the music. Where the Ainur had envisioned a world of harmony and beauty, there now appeared flaws and imperfections, places where the light did not reach, where shadows gathered and dark things took root. The other Ainur, seeing the corruption spreading, grieved for what had been lost, but they could not undo the changes that had been wrought. Despite this, the world that was created from the Unwind was still a place of great beauty and wonder. The Ainur who remained true to Ilúvatar's vision descended into this world, taking on physical forms to guide and protect the new creation. These Ainur became the Valar, the powers of the world, who would govern the elements and watch over the unfolding of history. Meren too descended into the world, but his path was already diverging from that of his brethren. Meron's descent into the world was not a fall in the physical sense, but a fall in spirit. He became obsessed with the imperfections he saw in the world, with the idea that it could be remade, reshaped according to his own design. In his mind, the world was a flawed creation that needed to be perfected, and he believed that only he had the knowledge and skill to do so. This belief became the seed of his downfall, for in seeking to perfect the world, he sought to dominate it. And so, Meren began to serve Melkor, who by now had fully embraced his role as the adversary, the Dark Lord Morgoth. Under Morgoth's tutelage, Meron's skills in craft and lore grew ever more formidable, but so too did his cruelty and malice. He learned to forge weapons of terror, to twist the natural order to his will, and to deceive and manipulate those who stood in his way. His fire, once a force for creation, became a fire of destruction, consuming all in its path. In time, Meren would take on a new name. Sauron, the Abhorred, a name that would become synonymous with fear and tyranny throughout Middle-earth. But in those early days, when he was still Meren, there was still a glimmer of the spirit he once was, a spirit that loved beauty and order. It was this very love, twisted and corrupted by pride and ambition, that led him down the path of darkness. The dawn of darkness, then, was not a single moment, but a series of choices, each leading Meren further from the light and deeper into the shadow. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible descent, like the slow fading of the stars before the coming of the night. And as the first light of creation gave way to the twilight of his corruption, Meren's fate was sealed, setting the stage for the long and terrible history that would follow, the history of Sauron, the Dark Lord. Meren, the spirit once known for his brilliance and unmatched skill in craftsmanship, had always possessed a unique passion for order and precision. In the beginning, this passion was a force for good, driving him to create marvels that reflected the beauty and harmony of the world. Meren, whose name meant the Admirable, was a being of immense potential, admired by his peers for his talents and dedication. But as with all great power, there lurked the potential for great peril, and Meren's tragic tale is one of how that potential was twisted into something dark and destructive. Meren's story is deeply intertwined with that of Melkor, the most powerful of the Ainur. Melkor was not always a being of darkness. In fact, he was the greatest of the Ainur, created with more power and knowledge than any other. But with his greatness came pride, and with pride came the seeds of rebellion. Melkor, who desired to create and dominate, became dissatisfied with merely contributing to Ilúvatar's grand design. He sought to impose his own will upon creation, to rule and reshape the world according to his desires. This desire led him to sow discord in the Unwind, the great music that shaped the universe, and in doing so, he set the stage for his own fall. It was Melkor's rebellion that first caught Meren's attention. While many of the Ainur were repulsed by Melkor's dissonance, Meren found himself drawn to it. There was something in Melkor's defiance that resonated with Meren's own yearning for order. Melkor's vision was one of absolute control, where he alone would dictate the structure of the world, eliminating all chaos and disorder. To Meron, who desired to perfect the world and eliminate its flaws, this vision was deeply alluring. However, Meron did not fall under Melkor's influence all at once. The corruption of the Bright One was a gradual process, a slow erosion of his virtues and ideals. In the beginning, Meron still clung to his original purpose, believing that he could use Melkor's power to bring about the order he so desperately sought. He rationalized his actions, convincing himself that the end justified the means, that a world ruled by him would be a world free of imperfection. Meron's descent began with small compromises. He started by adopting Melkor's methods, using force and manipulation to achieve his goals rather than persuasion and cooperation. He believed that his superior knowledge and skills gave him the right to impose his will on others for their own good. But with each step he took down this path, Meron became more and more entangled in Melkor's web. The more power he gained, the more he craved, and the more willing he became to do whatever was necessary to obtain it. One of the first major turning points in Meron's corruption came when he began to use his gifts for domination rather than creation. Meron's greatest talent was his ability to craft objects of immense power and beauty, imbuing them with a part of his own essence. But as his mind darkened, so too did his creations. No longer content to simply make beautiful things, Meron began to craft objects that could control and manipulate others. He forged weapons of war, tools of coercion, and devices that could bend the will of those who used them. Meron's skill in persuasion also became a tool of corruption. Once, he had used his voice to inspire and uplift others, to share his knowledge and help them achieve their own greatness. But under Melkor's influence, his voice became a weapon of deceit. He learned to twist words, to plant seeds of doubt and fear in the hearts of those he spoke to. He became a master of lies, able to convince even the wisest of beings to follow him down the path of darkness. It was during this time that Meron took on a new name, Sauron, which means the abhorred or the detestable. This name reflected the growing fear and hatred that others began to feel toward him as his true nature became apparent. Sauron, once Meron the Admirable, had become a figure of terror, a shadow that loomed over Middle-earth, corrupting all that he touched. Sauron's corruption was not only a matter of power, but also of perspective. As he fell deeper into darkness, he began to see the world in a different light. Where once he had seen beauty and potential, he now saw only flaws and weaknesses. He grew disdainful of the other races, believing them to be inferior and unworthy of their freedom. To Sauron, the free will of men and elves was not a gift, but a flaw, a source of chaos that needed to be eradicated. He saw himself as the only being capable of bringing order to the world, and he was willing to destroy anything that stood in his way. One of the most insidious aspects of Sauron's corruption was his ability to justify his actions. Even as he committed terrible deeds, he believed that he was acting in the world's best interest. He saw himself as a savior, a bringer of order in a world of chaos. This delusion allowed him to commit atrocities without remorse, believing that the suffering he caused was necessary for the greater good. It was this self-righteousness that made Sauron so dangerous, for he was not a simple tyrant seeking power for its own sake, but a fanatic who believed in the righteousness of his cause. Sauron's fall was further deepened by his relationship with Melkor. In Melkor, Sauron found a kindred spirit, someone who shared his desire for control and domination. But while Sauron admired and served Melkor, he also learned from him. He saw how Melkor's unchecked pride and wrath led to his downfall, and Sauron vowed not to make the same mistakes. Unlike Melkor, who was often ruled by his passions, Sauron was cold and calculating. He was patient, willing to bide his time and use subtlety and deceit to achieve his goals. This made him even more dangerous than his master, for he was not prone to the same fits of rage and destruction that often undermined Melkor's plans. As Sauron's power grew, so too did his ambition. He began to see himself not just as Melkor's lieutenant, but as his equal, or even his successor. He dreamed of a world where he alone would rule, where all beings would be subject to his will. In his mind, this was the only way to achieve true order. For only he possessed the knowledge and wisdom to govern the world properly. This ambition led Sauron to take greater and greater risks, to push the boundaries of his power in ways that would ultimately lead to his own downfall. Yet, despite his growing darkness, there remained a part of Sauron that remembered who he had once been. He still possessed a love for order and creation, though it had been twisted into a desire for control. There were moments when he would look upon the world he was trying to dominate and feel a pang of something like regret, an echo of the spirit he had once been. But these moments were fleeting, quickly smothered by his ambition and pride. Sauron's corruption reached its peak when he undertook the creation of the One Ring. This was his greatest and most terrible work, the culmination of all his knowledge and power. With the One Ring, Sauron poured a significant part of his own essence into a single object, binding his fate to it. The ring was a tool of ultimate control, designed to dominate the bearers of the other great rings and through them, all of Middle-earth. It was a physical manifestation of Sauron's desire to impose his will upon the world, to bring all life under his dominion. The creation of the One Ring marked the final step in Sauron's fall. With it, he became a being of pure malice, intent on bending all to his will. Yet in doing so, he also sealed his own fate, for the ring became both the source of his power and his greatest weakness. Sauron's desire for control had led him to create an object that ultimately made him vulnerable, and it was this vulnerability that would lead to his eventual downfall. In the end, the corruption of the Bright One is a tragic tale of how a being of immense potential was led astray by his own desires. Sauron's fall was not the result of a single moment of weakness, but a long, gradual descent into darkness, driven by his need for control and his belief in his own superiority. It is a story that serves as a warning of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the way that power can corrupt even the noblest of intentions. Sauron, once Mehron the Admirable, became a name of fear and loathing throughout Middle-earth, a symbol of the destructive power of pride and the lust for domination. The tale of Sauron is not only a story of corruption and fall, but also one of creation, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of dominion. The chapter of his life known as Forging Destiny is one where Sauron's transformation from a powerful servant of Morgoth into a Dark Lord in his own right was fully realized. This transformation was marked by his most infamous and devastating act, the creation of the One Ring. In this act, Sauron not only forged an object of immense power, but also set the course for his own destiny, a path that would intertwine with the fate of Middle-earth for millennia. To understand the significance of the One Ring, we must first delve into Sauron's motivations and the steps that led to its creation. After the defeat of Morgoth at the end of the First Age, Sauron was left without his master and mentor. For a time, he lay hidden, his spirit weakened by the fall of his lord. But Sauron was nothing if not resilient, and the void left by Morgoth's absence soon fueled his ambition. He saw an opportunity to rise from the ashes of defeat and claim dominion over Middle-earth for himself. In the Second Age, Sauron took on a new guise, adopting the fair and pleasing form of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. This was a calculated move, for Sauron understood that power could be gained not just through brute force, but through deception and manipulation. By presenting himself as a benevolent teacher, he sought to win the trust of the elves, who were the most powerful and knowledgeable beings in Middle-earth at that time. The elves, particularly those of Eregion, were skilled in the art of crafting, and they were eager to learn from Anatar. Under his guidance, they forged the Rings of Power, a series of magical rings that would grant their wearers great abilities and influence. These rings were intended to preserve the beauty of Middle-earth and enhance the powers of their bearers. However, Sauron had a more sinister purpose in mind. While the elves labored to create the Rings of Power, Sauron secretly began his own project deep within the fires of Mount Doom. There, he forged a single ring, one that would bind the others to his will. The One Ring was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was a conduit for Sauron's power, a part of his very essence, imbued with his malice, his cunning, and his unyielding will to dominate. Through the One Ring, Sauron intended to control all life in Middle-earth, bringing the free peoples under his absolute rule. The forging of the One Ring was an act of both creation and destruction. On one hand, it was a testament to Sauron's skill and intellect. The ring was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, an object of beauty and simplicity that belied its true nature. It was designed to be both alluring and dangerous, capable of corrupting even the most noble of hearts. On the other hand, the creation of the One Ring marked the final, irrevocable step in Sauron's descent into darkness. In pouring so much of his essence into the ring, Sauron not only increased his power, but also made himself vulnerable. The ring became both the source of his strength and the key to his potential downfall. When Sauron placed the One Ring upon his finger, the true extent of his plan was revealed. The elves, who had forged the other rings of power, immediately sensed Sauron's betrayal. Through their own rings, they felt the malevolent presence of the One Ring and realized that they had been deceived. In horror, they removed their rings, preventing Sauron from exerting his control over them. This unexpected resistance infuriated Sauron, but it also spurred him into action. The failure to enslave the elves through subtlety led Sauron to adopt a more direct approach. He raised a great army, comprised of orcs, trolls, and men who had fallen under his sway, and waged war on the free peoples of Middle-earth. This period, known as the War of the Elves and Sauron, was marked by brutal conflicts and widespread devastation. Sauron's forces swept across the land, and the fires of war consumed many of the great elven realms. In these battles, the true power of the One Ring became evident. With it, Sauron could inspire terror and despair in his enemies, bending their wills to his own. His presence on the battlefield was overwhelming, as he seemed invincible, a dark shadow that blotted out hope. Yet, even with the One Ring, Sauron was not invincible. The elves, led by the powerful and wise Gil-galad and Elrond, fought back with all their might, and with the help of their allies. They were able to resist Sauron's onslaught. Despite the resilience of the elves and their allies, the cost of their resistance was high. Many lives were lost, and entire kingdoms were laid to waste. Sauron's war left deep scars on Middle-earth, scars that would never fully heal. Yet, it was in this crucible of conflict that Sauron's destiny was forged. For while he was ultimately defeated in this age, driven back and forced to retreat to the shadows, he had also planted the seeds of his return. The One Ring, though it had not achieved its full purpose, remained intact, and through it, Sauron's spirit endured. Sauron's defeat in the Second Age did not diminish his determination to dominate Middle-earth. On the contrary, it fueled his resolve to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. Over the centuries, he began to rebuild his strength, always with the knowledge that as long as the One Ring existed, so too would his power. He sent out his servants to search for the ring, knowing that if he could regain it, he would once again be unstoppable. The ring itself, however, had its own will, shaped by the malice and cunning of its creator. It sought to return to Sauron, but in the meantime, it left a trail of destruction and corruption in its wake. Those who came into possession of the ring were consumed by its power, transformed by their desire for it. The ring promised power, but it delivered only ruin, as it slowly corrupted the hearts and minds of those who sought to wield it. One of the most tragic aspects of the ring's influence was its ability to turn even the purest of intentions into darkness. Men, who were particularly susceptible to its allure, were often the most affected. The ring amplified their desires, turning them into tyrants and despots, obsessed with power and control. Even the wisest and most noble beings were not immune to its influence. The ring had the power to bring out the worst in its bearers, to twist their virtues into vices. Sauron's destiny, therefore, was inextricably linked to the fate of the One Ring. His power and his very existence were bound to it, and as long as the ring endured, so too did the shadow of Sauron. Yet this bond was also his greatest weakness, for without the ring, Sauron could never fully return to his former strength. The ring was both his greatest triumph and his ultimate downfall. The forging of the One Ring was a turning point not just for Sauron, but for all of Middle-earth. It set in motion a chain of events that would span thousands of years, leading to the epic struggles of the Third Age and the final confrontation between the forces of light and darkness. The ring became the focal point of a great and terrible quest, one that would decide the fate of the world. In the end, Sauron's destiny, like that of the ring, was one of inevitable destruction. Though he sought to dominate Middle-earth and bring all life under his rule, his own actions ensured his downfall. The One Ring, created to be the instrument of his power, became the instrument of his defeat. When the ring was finally destroyed, so too was Sauron, his spirit shattered and his power extinguished. The legacy of Sauron's forging of the One Ring, however, would live on. It was a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the corrupting influence of power, and of the devastating consequences of seeking to control others. Sauron's fate serves as a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and that in the end, the pursuit of absolute power leads only to ruin. His story is one of tragedy and hubris, a tale of a being who sought to forge his own destiny, only to be undone by the very forces he sought to control. Sauron was not only a master of war and craftsmanship, but also a grand architect of deception. He understood that to truly dominate Middle-earth, brute force alone would not suffice. The minds and hearts of its people had to be ensnared as well. His weapon of choice in this subtle war was not the sword, but lies, manipulation, and the careful weaving of a vast web of deceit that would span centuries. The chapter of his life known as Webs of Deceit reveals Sauron's unparalleled skill in the art of subterfuge, where he cloaked his dark intentions behind masks of benevolence, friendship, and even divine authority. The foundation of Sauron's strategy was his ability to disguise his true nature. After the fall of Morgoth at the end of the First Age, Sauron knew that the free peoples of Middle-earth, particularly the elves, would never willingly submit to him if they recognized him for what he was, the chief lieutenant of their greatest enemy. Thus he adopted the guise of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, a fair and wise being who appeared to be a friend to the elves. This was the first of many masks Sauron would wear, each carefully crafted to exploit the desires and fears of those he sought to control. Anatar presented himself as a bringer of knowledge and enlightenment. He played upon the elves' deep love of craftsmanship and their desire to preserve the beauty of Middle-earth, offering them the secrets of ring-making. In this, he was extraordinarily successful, particularly among the elves of Eregion, who were led by Celebrimbor, a descendant of Fëanor. Celebrimbor and his people were highly skilled smiths, and under Anatar's guidance, they forged the rings of power, magical rings that would grant their wearers great abilities and ensure the longevity of their realms. The elves believed they were creating tools to protect and enhance their world, unaware that they were playing directly into Sauron's hands. Sauron's deception was not simply a matter of hiding his true identity. He carefully tailored his words and actions to appeal to the hopes and ambitions of those he sought to manipulate. To the elves, he spoke of preserving their fading lands, of holding back the decay and change that threatened their immortal lives. He knew that the elves, who had seen the beauty of Valinor and lived through the horrors of the First Age, longed for stability and permanence in a world that was constantly changing. Sauron's promises seemed to offer them exactly what they desired, a way to halt the passage of time and keep Middle-earth in a state of eternal splendor. Yet, Sauron's deceit extended far beyond the elves. His influence spread across Middle-earth, touching the lives of men and dwarves as well. To men, he often appeared as a godlike figure, demanding worship and promising power in return for loyalty. Sauron understood that men were more easily swayed by promises of power and immortality than the elves, who were already immortal and more cautious of such offers. He played upon the weaknesses of men, their ambition, their fear of death, and their desire for power, using these traits to bind them to his will. The dwarves, while less susceptible to Sauron's influence than men, were not immune to his machinations. Through his teachings to the elves, Sauron indirectly influenced the creation of the rings of power that were given to the dwarven lords. These rings, though they did not corrupt the dwarves as they did men, nonetheless inflamed their greed and desire for wealth. The dwarves became more reclusive, hoarding their treasures and becoming increasingly isolated from the other peoples of Middle-earth. This served Sauron's purposes well, as it sowed division and mistrust among the free peoples, weakening their ability to unite against him. One of the most significant and tragic examples of Sauron's deceit was his involvement with the Númenóreans, the great seafaring people descended from the men who had aided the elves in the wars against Morgoth. The Númenóreans were mighty and wise, blessed with long life and great knowledge. However, they also harbored a deep fear of death, a fear that Sauron would expertly exploit. Sauron's initial attempts to dominate the Númenóreans were met with failure. They were too powerful, too proud, and their leaders at first were wary of him. But Sauron was nothing if not patient. He waited, biding his time, until the opportunity presented itself. That opportunity came in the form of Ar-Pharazôn, the last and most ambitious king of Númenor. Ar-Pharazôn was a man of great pride and even greater ambition. He desired to rule not only Númenor, but all of Middle-earth, and he viewed Sauron as a threat to his dominion. To prove his might, Ar-Pharazôn sailed to Middle-earth with a great army, intent on capturing Sauron and bringing him back to Númenor in chains. Sauron, however, did not resist. Instead, he saw in this apparent defeat the seeds of his greatest victory. When Sauron was brought to Númenor, he did not appear as a defeated foe, but as a wise and humble counselor. He used his captivity to his advantage, slowly poisoning the mind of Ar-Pharazôn with visions of power and immortality. Sauron convinced the king that the Valar, the godlike beings who had granted Númenor its power and wisdom, were not to be revered but feared, that they were jealous of Númenor's greatness and sought to keep men subservient. He played upon Ar-Pharazôn's pride, suggesting that Númenóreans could achieve immortality if they were willing to defy the Valar and seize it for themselves. Sauron's manipulation of Ar-Pharazôn and the Númenóreans is perhaps his most masterful stroke of deceit. He turned their greatest strength, their loyalty to the Valar and their desire for knowledge, into their greatest weakness. Under Sauron's influence, the Númenóreans began to worship Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, believing that by doing so, they would be granted eternal life. They built great temples to Morgoth, performed dark rituals, and ultimately, they turned away from the Valar entirely. Sauron's deceit reached its zenith when he convinced Ar-Pharazôn to launch an invasion of Valinor itself, the land of the gods, in a bid to seize immortality by force. This act of hubris was Sauron's final devastating blow to Númenor. The Valar, in response, called upon Ilúvatar, the One, who sank the island of Númenor beneath the sea, destroying its people and their once great civilization. However, Sauron was not entirely victorious in this endeavor. Though he succeeded in corrupting Númenor and bringing about its downfall, he himself was caught in the cataclysm. His physical form was destroyed, and while his spirit survived, it was greatly weakened. He fled back to Middle-earth, where he would slowly rebuild his strength, but he was never again able to assume a fair and pleasing form. From that point on, he would be a figure of shadow and terror, his once subtle deceptions giving way to a more direct and brutal quest for power. Even in his weakened state, Sauron's web of deceit continued to ensnare the peoples of Middle-earth. The destruction of Númenor left a power vacuum that Sauron was quick to exploit. He resumed his campaign of conquest, this time through open war, but he still relied heavily on his ability to deceive and manipulate. He used fear as his primary tool, spreading rumors and falsehoods to divide his enemies and turn them against one another. He also continued to manipulate men, offering power and wealth to those who would serve him. This was most evident in his dealings with the Southrons and Easterlings, who became some of his most loyal followers. These peoples, already isolated and mistrustful of the elves and dwarves, were easy targets for Sauron's manipulations. He promised them dominion over their lands and wealth beyond measure if they would fight for him, and many did, swelling the ranks of his armies. Sauron's deceit was not limited to those he sought to dominate. He also deceived his own servants. He played them against each other, ensuring that none would grow too powerful or too loyal to anyone but him. This was particularly evident in his dealings with the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, who were once kings of men. Sauron gave them the 9 rings of power, which slowly corrupted them, transforming them into his most feared and loyal servants. Yet even they were not immune to Sauron's manipulation. He kept them in a state of constant fear and dependency, ensuring that their wills were entirely subjugated to his own. The legacy of Sauron's web of deceit is one of mistrust, division, and fear. He understood that the greatest power lay not in armies or weapons, but in the ability to control the minds and hearts of others. Through his lies and manipulations, he was able to bring great kingdoms to ruin, corrupt the noblest of beings, and spread darkness across Middle-earth. Sauron's mastery of deceit ensured that even in defeat his influence would linger, casting a long shadow over the world that would take generations to dispel. Sauron's legacy is not merely the story of a fallen Dark Lord, but a profound and far-reaching impact on the world of Middle-earth. His influence extended far beyond his own reign, shaping the course of history and leaving a shadow that would loom over the lands for ages. The chapter known as The Shadow's Legacy explores how Sauron's actions, both direct and indirect, continued to affect Middle-earth long after his physical defeat, influencing its peoples, its cultures, and its very fabric. When Sauron was finally defeated at the end of the Third Age, the destruction of the One Ring led to his ultimate fall. His physical form was destroyed, and his spirit was cast into the void, rendered incapable of directly influencing the world. However, the consequences of his reign were deeply ingrained in the lands he had once sought to dominate. The Shadow's legacy was not erased with his defeat, but rather became an indelible part of Middle-earth's history, culture, and geography. One of the most immediate impacts of Sauron's fall was the reshaping of political and social structures. The power vacuum left by his defeat required new leaders and new forms of governance. The free peoples of Middle-earth, who had been united in their struggle against Sauron, now faced the challenge of rebuilding their societies. The kingdoms of men, such as Gondor and Rohan, had to reassert their sovereignty and redefine their roles in a world where the looming threat of Sauron was no longer an immediate concern. Gondor, in particular, was profoundly affected by the shadow of its former enemy. The city of Minas Tirith, which had been a bastion of resistance against Sauron's forces, now stood as a symbol of hope and renewal. However, the scars of war were evident. The kingdom faced the daunting task of healing its wounds, rebuilding its cities, and restoring its economy. The people of Gondor had to come to terms with the immense losses they had suffered, including the death of their king, Denethor, and the destruction wrought by Sauron's armies. The restoration of peace was not immediate, and the effects of Sauron's war would be felt for generations. In Rohan, the impact of Sauron's shadow was equally profound. The Rohirrim, who had played a crucial role in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, found themselves at the center of a new era. The kingdom, led by King Eoma, faced the challenge of ensuring that the unity and strength displayed during the war would translate into a stable and prosperous future. The Rohirrim's own land had been ravaged, and rebuilding their homes and infrastructure was a monumental task. The legacy of their bravery in the face of Sauron's forces, however, became a source of inspiration and pride. Sauron's influence also extended to the peoples who had been directly subjected to his rule. The orcs and other dark creatures that had served him were left without a master. Their scattered remnants became a lingering threat, often seeking to exploit the chaos left in Sauron's wake. The remnants of the Dark Lord's armies continued to harass the lands, though they were less organized and less dangerous without the central command of their master. This lingering threat required vigilance and military action from the new rulers of Middle-earth. Another significant aspect of Sauron's legacy was the lasting impact on the lands and environment. Sauron's reign had been marked by widespread devastation. The land surrounding Mordor, once lush and vibrant, had been corrupted and scarred. The Dark Lord's influence had left a blight upon the land, a physical manifestation of his malevolence. Even after his defeat, the healing of these lands was a slow and arduous process. The rejuvenation of the environment became a symbol of hope and renewal for the peoples of Middle-earth, a reminder of the resilience of nature and the possibility of recovery even after great darkness. The impact of Sauron's legacy also extended to the realm of lore and myth. The story of Sauron became a cautionary tale, a mythic narrative that would be told and retold for generations. His rise, his reign, and his fall were woven into the collective memory of Middle-earth, becoming part of the history and folklore of its peoples. The dark lessons of his rule were taught to children, recounted in songs, and recorded in the annals of history. The tale of Sauron served as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, the corrupting influence of power, and the importance of unity and vigilance in the face of evil. In the wake of Sauron's defeat, the Shire and its inhabitants experienced a period of relative peace. The hobbits, who had played a crucial role in the destruction of the One Ring, found themselves living in a world that was beginning to recover from the shadow of the Dark Lord. The Shire, though largely untouched by the direct effects of Sauron's war, had been indirectly affected by the larger conflict. The return of peace allowed the hobbits to return to their quiet and idyllic lives, but the scars of their experiences remained. The story of the Ring-bearers and their journey became an integral part of hobbit folklore, a reminder of the extraordinary events that had unfolded beyond their borders. The legacy of Sauron also had an impact on the elves, who were deeply affected by the events of the Third Age. The elves, who had long been the keepers of ancient wisdom and beauty, found themselves facing a new reality. The destruction of the One Ring marked the end of their long struggle against darkness, but it also signaled the beginning of their departure from Middle-earth. The elves began to leave the world, sailing to the Undying Lands to escape the lingering shadows of their past. This migration marked the end of an era, the waning of the Elven Age, and the transition to a new age dominated by men. In the wider world, the legacy of Sauron influenced the shifting balance of power. The Fourth Age, which began with Sauron's defeat, was characterized by the rise of new powers and the decline of the old. The world was changing, and the old ways were giving way to new forms of governance and new cultural dynamics. The impact of Sauron's rule was felt in the shifting alliances, the evolving political landscapes, and the changing cultural practices of Middle-earth. Sauron's shadow also left an imprint on the arts and literature of Middle-earth. The stories of his reign, the epic battles, and the heroic deeds of the free peoples became central themes in the literature of the age. The deeds of heroes like Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf were immortalized in songs and stories, ensuring that the memory of their struggle would endure. The art and literature of the Fourth Age were deeply influenced by the legacy of Sauron, reflecting both the triumphs and the tragedies of the previous era. In conclusion, the legacy of Sauron's shadow is a multifaceted and enduring one. His impact was felt across Middle-earth, influencing its political structures, its environment, its peoples, and its culture. Though he was ultimately defeated, the consequences of his rule were deeply ingrained in the world he sought to dominate. The story of Sauron became a powerful and enduring myth, a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of resilience in the face of darkness. The shadow he cast would linger long after his fall, shaping the course of history and leaving a mark that would not be easily erased.
you.
you.